All right, so the first thing I'd like to talk about is my quick start guide that I brought up at the very beginning. Essentially, the three main things to remember here are color preview, bump add, and color to number to drive roughness. So here you have a scene that's pretty much entirely been built just using those, if I'm not mistaken. You can see the roughness changes in the rock down here. You can see the material is got several textures going on here. And I'm going to actually show you how to do that. But first, let's take a look at the material graph and see what's going on inside of it. So the way things are set up currently, I have my metal texture that's attached to an input, and I'm using a color to number node to drive the roughness. That's how I've kind of come up with how this texture is going to create a rough versus shiny effect on its surface. And then down here, I have that same texture map driving the bump. And you can actually, instead of doing it that way, you can take the output from the existing metal texture, which has already been set up the way you want it, and you can plug that into the bump as well. And then it'll affect it at the exact same scale and settings as your color to number for your roughness. So the three things: color preview, bump add, color to number. If you look at the top of your ribbon here in the material graph workspace, this is where you're going to find your different tools to use, and as well as your preview color. A lot faster way to go about using preview color is to actually just hit the hotkey C. And this really speeds up your workflow because you don't have to wait for images to res up. Let me give you an example here. So if I'm looking at what the scale of this texture is and I hit C, you can kind of see what that texture is looking like. And it's isolated that over the actual material. So it makes it really easy for me to change my scale and see how that actually affects my surface. And then when I'm done, I just hit C and then it'll go back to my original material. Now I use that one a lot when it comes to color to number, when it comes to scaling, when it comes to bumps, because it just lets me kind of get a better idea of how my node is going to be affecting the parent material. And then if we go over here, color to number, and let me actually show you this real quick. So if I got rid of my color to number node entirely, let me just move that guy out of the way, and I had this guy attached to my color, you can right click, go into your utility nodes and pick your color to number from here, or you can actually right click on that connection point that you want to add your color to number to, hit utilities, and then that's where you could add your color to number as well. So I'm going to go ahead and do that real quick. And then now we have our color to number, and color to number is going to drive our roughness values. Double check that. So that's actually driving our color at the moment. So I want to get that to drive our roughness. So I can go plus, and I'll select the roughness, and now it's connected to my roughness input. And you can actually see on the model, since this is scaled up and it's a fresh color to number, that there's a pretty drastic difference between my scratches and non-scratch surface. Now there's this kind of rough to shiny texture going on here. Maybe res up for a second so you can see it a little bit more clearly. And then basically, again, with color to number, it's going to affect your roughness in this case, and 0 is going to be black while white is 1. So if you look over here in our properties, anything that has a 0, so your input from, that's going to be a black, this is going to be a black, this is going to represent a white, and this is going to represent a white. So if I, again, hit my color preview, I can take a peek at how that color preview is affecting my texture that I've applied. And then I can actually go ahead and start adjusting how much I want it to actually affect my parent node. So as you can see, the output from, which is 0, is affecting my dark colors, and then my output 2 is affecting my light colors. So you can create a more homogeneous kind of material. And so in this instance, if I were to hit C, you can see that a lot of that roughness has kind of, the change in roughness has kind of dissipated. It's a lot more homogeneous at that point. And then smooth basically adds an S curve to your texture as well. So yeah, that's a really, really convenient way to add a bunch of different textures and roughness and add different elements. And the other thing I was going to talk about is bumps. So this does a great job for creating that kind of scratch to rough surface. If you have materials where like maybe like a marble countertop or like a tavertine marble where there are some areas that are shinier than others, that's a great way to go about doing that. But what if I want to add multiple bumps to create like a really kind of more in-depth surface? So again, you can right click on the workspace, you can hit your utilities and choose your bump add node from here, or you can get your nodes from here, utilities, bump add node. But again, for the sake of convenience and speed, I like to right click on the connection point, utilities, and then bump add right there. And so basically what's happening here is you have a node now. Let me see if I can get a better view. So you have a node now that is allowing you to plug in a secondary bump input. So I'm going to go ahead and just open up, let's use a noise texture. So if I plug that texture into my bump, again, let's hit C, and you can see the scale. I'm going to dial that scale back a bit, and I'm going to increase my bump height just so it's kind of more apparent. And then now you can kind of see how that bump, I'm going to even dial it back a little bit more. But you can see how that bump's affecting the surface, and you can see the original metal texture that was applied as well. Excuse me. So inside the bump node, if you double click that, you have your ratio, you have your weight 1 and your weight 2. And essentially, ratio speaks for itself. It's the ratio between the two of them. And then weight 1 is going to control how much the first bump is going to affect your surface, and weight 2 is the same for the second bump. So if I were to adjust these, I can, pull one texture out farther than the other one, or make the other one sit back farther than the one that I want to kind of stand out. So that one's really nice to use. You can create really interesting surfaces. You just got to kind of imagine what your surface might look like. And the really cool part about this node is you can kind of stack them infinitely. So although there's only 2 inputs here, I can right click another one of these lines and I can add a bump add node, and then I can plug in another texture. Let's just throw a mesh on there, and then I can throw another one on there as well, and I can just keep stacking these as much as I want to create the kind of surface I like. So just using these different elements, the roughness, controlling roughness with color to number, your bump add, and then getting comfortable using the hotkey for the color preview, you're going to be able to immediately jump up the level of your renders and create significantly more realistic products at the end. Oh, and something I didn't mention as well, if you go into your color to number, you can actually invert how the roughness affects your surface. So if I were to apply this and maybe my surface was supposed to be a gloss, but it ended up being kind of rough and the scratches were glossy, that could work if it's kind of scratching through like a soft touch material, but usually scratches are kind of rougher than the surface it was on. So I would just invert this to 1 and that to 0, and then you would essentially have your inverted material. I adjusted these down here, so you would do it down here instead. But yeah, that's essentially how you go about doing that. All right, so the next thing I would like to talk about are opacity maps. So here's that KeyShot ball I had inside of our presentation. And basically what's happening here is I've used a texture on the opacity of my label to create this kind of scratched away, flaked off paint effect on top of my KeyShot ball. And I'm going to open up the material graph. And I'm sure many of you have realized this. When you're opening up a multi-material or you pull something off the KeyShot cloud that has a multi-material, this graph gets a little crazy. And that's because everything, all the different materials that are making up your project space, if you have a multi-material on there, are going to show up on the same material graph. And like I said earlier, the one that's selected currently has an orange kind of outline that lets you control which one you're doing. So I'm going to actually move this out of the way a little bit just so we can focus on what we're looking at right now. I'll bring that down. So all I did here is initially I pulled a textured chrome material from the material library over here. I dragged and dropped it onto there, and that's what created this metal on the surface and the noise texture that was there. So this little trifecta was just created through a drag and drop. What I've done is I've used a texture map, this chipped metal texture map, and I've applied a diffuse material as a label on top of that chrome, and then I gave that diffuse material this blue color right here. So with this texture map, I'm using that as the bump because you can see that there's kind of height. I wanted to get that feeling that there was actually paint that was chipped away. And then I'm also using that under the opacity. So this is another one of those things that you can control using color to number. But in this case, I'm just leaving the map the way it is. I went in here, I changed the contrast a little bit in the width and the height, and that's how I ended up with this kind of effect going on there. But you can have greater control if you use color to number and start actually messing with the parameters. But essentially, to create an opacity map, all you would do is you take a texture and you drop it into your opacity, and then that's how you would determine the degree to which something is gonna shine through or pull through. Now, another cool effect with opacity maps, let me actually zoom out and then we will zoom in, pull this guy up, and we'll get this guy out of the way. So I'm using the exact same chipped metal texture on this one. So let me back out real quick and switch to worn edges. Okay, so that's what we're talking about right now. I go back to the material graph. You can see now it's selected in orange. I'm using the same base material, same diffuse. The only difference here is that instead of having the chipped metal drive the bump, I'm using the contour texture to drive the opacity. So this is no longer driving the opacity, but it's still driving the bump, and the contour is now driving the opacity. And basically what I've done here using the contour is I've adjusted my contour angle, my contour width, and I've used that to create this kind of faded edges. So if you're trying to create like maybe a soft touch material where, you know, like a cell phone case that gets a lot of use and the edges wear out, this would be a really good way to go about making that. So you have a lot of things you can do with the opacity. You just got to get a little creative and spend some time exploring what's possible inside there. But that's using the opacity input. So the next one I'm going to talk about is the color adjust node. Again, this one's pretty self-explanatory, pretty simple. I have a kettle here, and I've applied a camouflage texture to it. I actually have, let me delete this. There you go. So I'll apply that directly to my color, and you can see that it's the exact same. And then now if I want to do a color adjust node and I want to change the hue or colorize it and give it a tint, again, same ways as before, right click the workspace, hit the node library from the drop down up here. I'm just going to go ahead and right click that, utilities, and we're going to do color adjust. So with color adjust selected, it is outlined in orange. On the right here, you have the properties, and you have the color, which is currently input as the camouflage, and you have your colorize option. So if I want to colorize it and give it a tint, I can just kind of hit that colorize button, come in here, and then anything that I drop over it is going to give it a tint in the color that I'd like to use. So if you're trying to tint something, that's a way to go about doing it. If I want to change the hue, you just jump over to this hue slider, and like instantaneously you can just jump through a bunch of different hues. It's really nice that you don't have to go into Photoshop to create a new texture to drop this in here. It's also nice because it works with the procedural textures as well. And if you want to desaturate something entirely or highly saturate it, you got that here, values of colors, and then your contrast as well. So this is a really cool node. I like this node because it just lets you do a bunch of little quick material variations. So that's definitely something to consider if you're trying to do colorways or finish options. So that was quick and easy. The next thing I want to talk to you about is creating labels in KeyShot. So let's look at that. Make sure I paused the last one. Yeah, okay. So creating labels in KeyShot. Again, it seems a little intimidating, but it's relatively easy. Let's bring that kind of over here. And we'll open up the material library. So I already have this thing set up. I'll kind of reset it up for you. It seems a little intimidating. It seems like there's a lot going on here, but really not too much. We have our ceramic glaze and our paint attached to the surface. I've used a leather texture to create this kind of ceramic-like roughness on the actual mug. So that's it. That's just driving the bump right there. And then I have a texture map, and I've used this texture map as the color on top of the actual label that I've made. And I've used that to drive my first bump, and I've added a secondary bump onto that label as well, which is what's creating this kind of hammered, rough texture on this foil label. And the reason why it looks foil is because my color that I'm using is actually a metal. So I'm going to kind of disconnect these, and let's run through making a label real quick. So in that case, I use the KeyShot logo, and I'm just going to drag and drop that onto there. I'll select Add Label, and then I can, let me clean this up real quick. So here's my label that I just added, and I want to scale that label down. I can do it outside of this, but since this is open, I'm just going to do it right here. So I'm going to scale this label down into something that's usable, and then I'm going to actually move that label just so, you know, it's kind of more centered. Let's see if I can. So yeah, that'll work for now. So I've moved my label. I've attached it as a label to my parent material, which is the ceramic glaze right here. And now I want to make it like a shiny foil. So I'll just go in here to my plastic. I'll change my material type to a metal. And then immediately you kind of have this metal shininess going on. I can adjust the roughness of that metal. I'll give it a little bit of roughness since foil is usually not just perfectly shiny. And then I want this to also drive the bump so I can make it look like it's either debossed or embossed. So I've just taken another from that same output, I've dropped it onto my bump, and that's how I've kind of got this effect. And then now I want to texture it with some kind of, you don't have to texture it. If your goal is to create something that looks like this, then you'd be done at this point. But if I want to texture it like I had before, again, just add a bump add node, go to utilities, bump add node, and now I can pull a texture of any kind that I'd like. Let's use a noise fractal this time. And I'll drop that onto my bump. And then there's a little bit going on here, but again, C to color preview. You can see the scale of that texture. I'm gonna bring it down a little bit. I'm gonna turn some fall off and the bump height up. And then you hit C, and then that's the end result right there. It's kind of this beat up foil label. So that's essentially how you'd create a label. Again, this one's just set as a metal because I was imagining like a foil texture over it, but you could really change it to anything you'd like, plastic paint, and then it'll adopt those properties and you can adjust them accordingly as well. All right, our last little demo here, we are talking about the color fade animation. So here I just have a little tumbler. This one came off the cloud library. And I'm going to open up my material graph so you can see what's going on here. So the color fade animation is what's going to drive or the color fade node is what's going to drive my animation. Everything else here is essentially the same as what we've been covering. Again, super basic, like my getting started idea. You have your texture. It's using color to number to drive the roughness, and it's also being applied to the bump. That's how you're getting this really nice brushed effect on the actual model. And then all I've done is I've taken the color fade and I've attached it to my color input of my metal that's on the surface of my parent material. So when I do that, it'll automatically populate my animation timeline with that animation that you see here. So this will give you an idea of the preview of what's going on. You know, it'll go through the colors that I've determined. So this comes in really useful if you have an animation where there's a lot going on, there's rotations or exploded views, and you want to show colorways while that's happening. If the goal is to show a stationary product and show some colorways, depending on your setup, it might actually be faster to just quickly render out different colors or finishes as images and then composite them in like an editing program later. But if you're really kind of trying to make it be incorporated into more complex animation, then you would use a color fade animation. So back to the material graph, you can see in my properties here, I have the colors that I've determined to be what I want it to fade through. I have it set without a blend mode, so it's really sharp transitions, but if you'd like it to fade, you can hit blend, and then when you actually come in here, you'll see that there's a gradual transition between the colors rather than such a hard event. So let me actually show you that color fade node. Let me unplug that. And let's go to our animations and color fade. So if I plug in this color fade and I open that up, you can see that it's just a regular texture, excuse me, a regular gradient black to white, nothing special. This lets you control to the degree that that gradient is operating. And here's where you can kind of control like when it happens in context to your animation. You can change these colors, just double click on it, and you can pick anything. You can color pick as well if you see another color that you like, and then it'll assign that color. And then if you want to add more colors, you can hit this guy right here and it'll populate the gradient with another color node. So let's say I want this to go from white to red to black. That one will be white. But you notice that it's not really, it's kind of all over the place. There's nothing like specific occurring at a lot of time. So these little sliders, you can kind of maneuver them and use them to reduce how much fade there is between layers or how much it kind of bleeds into the next layer by just adjusting these guys right here. So that's how you go about building out your color fade animation. And as I said, it automatically populates your animation timeline down here. You can preview it by sliding through, and that's your color animation.